The air in the grand hall of the Zalvoran High Palace was thick with the scent of exotic incense, a heady mixture of spice and floral undertones. Captain Ethan Carter stood beneath the towering crystalline arches, his crisp diplomatic uniform feeling oddly stifling despite its immaculate tailoring. He had been in countless negotiations across the galaxy, but none had prepared him for this moment. Across from him, Lady Saravara watched him with the unshaken confidence of nobility, her violet-hued skin catching the shifting light like polished amethyst. Ethan had long known their relationship was unconventional. Their diplomatic exchanges had started with tense formalities, evolved into mutual respect, and then something neither had spoken aloud. Now, as she looked at him with unreadable intensity, he felt an uneasy weight in his chest. "Captain Carter," she began, her voice smooth yet edged with something that sent a chill down his spine. "I have given this great thought. It is time for us to formalize our bond." For a moment, Ethan was certain he had misheard. The words were precise, deliberate, yet impossible. His carefully structured mind, trained for tactical negotiations and interspecies diplomacy, failed to process what she had just proposed. "You mean marriage?" His voice lacked its usual steadiness. Saravara inclined her head slightly, an elegant gesture of affirmation. "Yes. A union between us would not only solidify our people's alliance, but also reflect the trust we have cultivated. You have earned a place among my kind, Ethan. Among my family." Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He knew how serious Zalvoran customs were about family, about honor. To be offered marriage was not just a personal declaration, it was a political one, a binding tie between their worlds. His mind raced with possibilities, consequences, the inevitable backlash from human command, the complications of interspecies relationships. But more than that, there was an undeniable warmth at the core of it. He cared for her. His lips parted, an answer forming, when she lifted a hand. "But before you answer, there is something you must understand." He exhaled, shoulders stiffening. Of course, there was a catch. "Go on." Saravara took a slow step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "A noble house in Zalvoran tradition is not strengthened by a single bond alone. Our families stand as one. A marriage to me is a marriage to all my sisters." Ethan blinked. He was certain his translator had malfunctioned. What? "You would not just be my husband," she clarified, her tone entirely serious. "You would be bound to my sisters as well. All of them." The silence that followed was oppressive. Ethan could practically feel the blood drain from his face. He had spent years navigating alien cultural intricacies, but this was something else entirely. "Saravara," he began carefully, running a hand through his short-cropped hair, "I don't think you fully understand human customs. Our species, we don't practice." He struggled for the right word. "Collective marriage like that. Nor do we expect you to abandon your ways," she countered smoothly. "But our traditions are not so easily disregarded, either. A union with one of us is a union with all. My sisters have already consented to this arrangement." That was when he noticed them. 4 figures stood at the entrance of the chamber, silent yet watchful. As they stepped forward, Ethan felt the weight of their scrutiny, each gaze carrying a different measure of assessment. The first was tall, even by Zalvoran standards, her presence exuding an air of military precision. Her silver-trimmed robes hinted at a warrior's discipline rather than courtly grace. She studied him with cold calculation, as if assessing his battlefield worth. The second had a wry, amused smirk, her stance far more relaxed. Her amber eyes sparkled with mischief, as if this entire situation were a game she had already won. The third moved with deliberate care, her expression serene yet unreadable. There was a weight to her presence, the quiet authority of someone who saw further than the moment. The fourth was the smallest, younger by all appearances, though he had learned long ago that appearances among alien species meant little. She met his gaze with quiet curiosity, no judgment, only patience. Saravara gestured to them. "Lady Vexari, my eldest sister, is the sword of our house. Savara, the cunning one, sees what others do not." Oravana, the scholar, holds wisdom beyond her years. And Velis, the youngest, is the heart of our family. Ethan took an unconscious step back, his mind a blur of shock. This was real. This was happening. He had come prepared to discuss trade agreements and border treaties, not to become entangled in what was effectively an interstellar royal marriage proposal with 5 women. You must understand, Saravara continued, her voice calm but firm.
This is not a demand, Ethan.
It is an offer. You are free to refuse. He nearly laughed. Free to refuse? As if declining a noble's proposal, one with enormous political implications, wouldn't cause a diplomatic catastrophe. As if walking away wouldn't sour everything they had built between their people. As if his own heart wasn't already dangerously entangled with hers. He exhaled slowly, then turned to face them all. And, if I accept? Vexari, the warrior, studied him with a new measure of respect. Then you will have the honor of standing among us as our equal. Savara smirked. And the challenge of keeping up. Oravana merely nodded, her expression unreadable. Velis gave the smallest of smiles. You won't be alone. Ethan's pulse thrummed, his mind warring with itself. Logic screamed at him to say no, to walk away. But a different part, something deeper, something human, whispered that this was more than just politics. This was something rare. He looked back at Saravara, at the quiet patience in her expression, the weight of expectation and vulnerability mixed in equal measure. He took a breath and made his choice. News of Captain Ethan Carter's impending marriage spread faster than any diplomatic transmission ever had. Across the Zalvoran homeworld, noble houses whispered of the unprecedented union, speculating on the strength it would bring to House Saravara. Within human Federation circles, the reaction was far less celebratory. What had begun as an exploratory mission had become an interspecies scandal, one that threatened to unravel carefully laid alliances and ignite a firestorm of political debate. Ethan stood in the communication chamber, arms crossed, as the holographic projection of Admiral Grayson flickered before him. The older man's face was carved from years of hardened leadership, his gaze sharp with disapproval. Tell me this is some kind of mistranslation, Captain. The words were slow, measured, dangerous. Ethan exhaled, forcing his shoulders to relax. No mistranslation, sir. The Zalvoran have a different understanding of marriage. This isn't just a personal decision, it's political. A bridge between our species. A bridge? Grayson's jaw tightened. What you're doing is creating an incident. Do you have any idea the kind of backlash we're facing? The Federation Council is losing its damn mind over this. Ethan had expected resistance, but the sheer force of it still caught him off guard. I didn't intend for this to become a crisis. And yet, here we are. Grayson shot back. Diplomatic relations are one thing, Carter, but binding yourself to 5 Zalvoran nobles? Do you understand what you've done? Ethan set his jaw. He understood all too well. The whispers from human officials, the scrutiny from Federation allies, the absurd debates unfolding in media outlets across human space. He had become a symbol of something larger than himself, a figure caught between tradition and progress, scandal and diplomacy. This isn't just about me, he said firmly. This is about trust between our species. The Zalvoran don't take commitments lightly, and neither do I. Grayson studied him for a long moment before letting out a slow breath. You're a damn fine officer, Carter. I'd hate to see you burn for this. I appreciate that, sir, Ethan replied, knowing full well that the flames were already rising. The transmission cut out, leaving him alone in the quiet hum of the chamber. Turning, he found Saravara leaning against the doorway, arms folded. That went well, she remarked dryly. Ethan sighed. Depends on your definition of well. She stepped closer, her expression unreadable. Do you regret your choice? He met her gaze without hesitation.
No.
But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't feeling the weight of it. Saravara studied him for a moment before nodding. Then it is good you are not alone in bearing it. She was right, of course. He wasn't alone. He had her, and he had the sisters he was still trying to understand. The following days were a blur of formal meetings and public appearances, each one more exhausting than the last. The Zalvoran nobility was eager to display the strength of the Union, while human officials scrambled to contain the political fallout. The media feasted on every detail, turning Ethan into both a symbol of interspecies unity and a subject of relentless scrutiny. But behind the politics and ceremony, another battle was brewing. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a discreet message, encoded and routed through layers of security. Ethan read it in silence, his expression hardening as the words sink in. There are those who will not allow this marriage to stand. Be prepared. Asterisk, asterisk. No name. No source. Just a warning. It wasn't unexpected. The Zalvoran noble structure thrived on power, and not everyone was pleased with Saravara's growing influence. The Human Federation had its dissenters as well, those who saw this union as a dangerous precedent rather than an opportunity. Ethan didn't have the luxury of ignoring the threat. That night, he found himself seated in the private halls of House Saravara, surrounded by the women who now shared his fate. The air was thick with quiet tension, the flickering glow of the chamber's crystalline lights casting shadows across the room. Vexery was the first to speak, her voice sharp. You received a threat. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded. A warning. No details, no clear source, but I don't think we can afford to dismiss it. Savara smirked, her golden eyes glinting with something between amusement and calculation. Well, that didn't take long. I was wondering when the cowards would make their move. Oravana, ever the measured scholar, leaned forward. This is no surprise. Some houses fear what our alliance will bring. They see an opportunity to disrupt it before it solidifies. Velis, quiet until now, spoke softly. Then we must show them that disruption is not an option. Ethan glanced at Saravara, who had yet to say a word. She met his gaze, and in that single look, he saw the weight of generations of nobility, the understanding of how power moved in unseen currents. She turned to her sisters. This is not just a political marriage. It is a declaration of unity. If there are those who wish to challenge it, we must be ready. Vexery's lips curled into something resembling a smile. Then let them come. We'll be waiting. Ethan exhaled, a grim certainty settling in his chest. The battle for this union had only just begun. The attack came in the dead of night. Ethan had barely closed his eyes when the palace alarms shrieked through the halls, their piercing wail shattering the silence. Instinct took over before thought. He was on his feet, sidearm in hand, pulse hammering as he moved. The moment he stepped into the corridor, Vexery was already there, her blade drawn, eyes sharp with anticipation rather than fear. They're inside, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Targeting the core chambers. Saravara's chambers. Ethan didn't need more than that. He fell into step beside Vexery, sprinting through the high-vaulted halls. The palace, once an emblem of serene grandeur, had become a battlefield. Zalvoran guards clashed with masked intruders in flowing black armor, their weapons crackling with energy. Blades met flesh, plasma bolts seared the air, and the acrid scent of burning metal filled his lungs. Vexery moved like a specter of death, cutting down the first assassin who dared step into her path. Ethan raised his sidearm and fired, dropping another with a clean shot between the eyes. There was no time for hesitation. As they neared Saravara's chambers, Savara appeared from the shadows, her lips curling in something dangerously close to amusement. I was wondering when they'd show some spine, she said, flipping a dagger between her fingers. Took them long enough. Ethan wasn't in the mood for theatrics. How many? Savara flicked her eyes toward the smoke-filled corridor. More than enough to make this interesting. He pressed forward, trusting that the sisters could hold their own. When he reached Saravara's chamber doors, he barely had time to register the energy blast before he was yanked backward. A plasma bolt slammed into the spot where he'd stood a second ago, the heat blistering even through his jacket. Oravana had pulled him out of the line of fire. She released him just as quickly, her face calm as she extended a hand. With a flick of her wrist, the walls of the corridor shimmered, and a gravitational pulse rippled outward, knocking two assassins off their feet. Ethan wasted no time finishing the job. The doors to Saravara's chambers burst open. Ethan rushed in, weapon raised, scanning for threats, until he saw her. Saravara stood in the center of the room, her robes torn, a long blade in her hand, and 3 bodies at her feet. Blood stained the floor in thick, dark pools. She turned at his entrance, her expression fierce, eyes alight with something primal. "You're late," she said. Ethan couldn't help the breath of laughter that escaped him. Even now, standing in the wreckage of an assassination attempt, she was unshaken. But there was no time to dwell on it. More intruders were coming. He could hear the clash of weapons just outside. Vexari and Sivara entered next, their weapons dripping with blood. Velis followed, breathless but unharmed, eyes scanning the room with quiet determination. Saravara met Ethan's gaze. "This was not a warning," she said, her voice low. "This was an execution attempt." He nodded grimly. "And they failed." Sivara smirked. "They'll regret that." Oravana stepped forward, her mind already working through the implications. The fact that they struck within the palace means they had inside help. This wasn't a rogue faction. This was calculated. Vexari wiped her blade clean. "Then we return the favor." Saravara studied the bodies at her feet, then straightened. "This attack was meant to sever our union before it could fully take root. But they have only made it stronger." She turned to Ethan. "Are you still certain of your choice?" He met her gaze, unwavering. "More than ever." A slow smile touched her lips. Outside, the last of the fighting died down. The assassins had failed, but their intent was clear. Their enemies would not stop until this alliance was shattered. Ethan holstered his weapon, glancing at the sisters who now stood at his side. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain. They were ready for war. The halls of the palace were still slick with blood when dawn broke over the Zalvoran capital. The aftermath of the attack left a heavy silence in its wake. Guards patrolled with renewed vigilance, their hands never straying far from their weapons. The bodies had been removed, but the scent of charred metal and scorched stones still lingered in the air. Ethan stood on one of the high balconies, overlooking the sprawling city below, his mind as restless as the skies. Saravara approached without a sound, though he had learned to recognize her presence without needing to see her. She came to stand beside him, her gaze sharp as she studied the horizon. "They will come again," she said without preamble. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "But next time, they will not send assassins. Next time, they will send armies." It was not fear in her voice, only certainty. The attack had not been meant to simply eliminate him or sever their bond. It had been a message, a warning that their enemies were gathering, that those who opposed their union would escalate until there was nothing left to salvage. Vexari entered the balcony, her stance rigid, her warrior's pride barely concealing the fury simmering beneath her skin. "The noble houses are already dividing," she announced. "Some stand with us. Others claim our marriage has compromised the integrity of the Zalvoran line." Sivara arrived next, rolling her eyes. Translation: "They fear what they cannot control." Oravana and Velis followed in silence, their presence completing the circle that had formed around Ethan. He wasn't just an outsider anymore, he was woven into the fate of this house, their house. "We cannot afford to wait for them to strike first," Vexari continued. "We must act." Ethan nodded, his mind working through the possibilities. He had fought in wars before, but this was different. He wasn't leading soldiers. He was navigating the treacherous landscape of Zalvoran politics, a battlefield just as deadly as any warfront. Saravara turned to him. "This marriage was meant to be a symbol of unity. But symbols mean nothing if we do not give them power." Her words settled deep within him. He had spent years serving the Federation, believing in diplomacy, in the idea that alliances could be forged through trust. Now, that belief was being tested in ways he had never imagined. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. Oravana answered first. "We need to gather our allies. Show them that our union is not a weakness, but a foundation for something greater." Savara's grin was sharp. and remind our enemies that we are not so easily removed. Ethan looked at each of them in turn, at the fire in their eyes, the unshakable conviction in their stance. This was more than just a marriage now. This was a declaration of war, not of bloodshed, but of survival. Saravara stepped closer, lowering her voice. This will not be easy. You will be tested in ways you have never been before. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. Then let them test me. For the first time since the attack, a true smile touched her lips. The battle for their future had begun. The war began not with a declaration, but with whispers. Across the noble houses, alliances shifted like sand underfoot. Some swore fealty to House Saravara, recognizing the strength that Ethan and Saravara's union represented. Others retreated into secrecy, plotting in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. There were no official declarations of rebellion, only small fractures that deepened with each passing day. Trade agreements were quietly revoked. Military forces were reassigned without explanation. Messages arrived bearing vague, ominous warnings. Ethan watched it unfold with growing unease. War among the Zalvoran wouldn't look like the conflicts he had known in the Federation. It would be swift, calculated, and drenched in the weight of centuries-old feuds. A single misstep could shatter everything they had built. The palace had become a fortress in all but name. The guards were doubled, patrols reinforced, and every corridor was lined with watchful eyes. Yet, Ethan knew better than to feel secure. The last attack had come from within. The next would be no different. Saravara stood before the great war table in the high chamber, surrounded by her sisters. A projection of the Zalvoran homeworld flickered above the polished obsidian surface, red markers glowing where conflicts had begun to brew. She traced a clawed finger along the edges of contested space, her golden eyes narrowing. "They're testing us," she murmured. "They want to see if we will break before the Real War begins." Vexori leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Let them test. We will answer." Oravana was more measured. "Not yet. If we strike too soon, we give them the excuse they need to rally others against us." Savara exhaled impatiently. "So, what do you suggest? We wait until they decide to storm the gates." Ethan listened, absorbing each argument before finally speaking. "We don't wait, but we don't strike blindly either. We move first, just not how they expect." All eyes turned to him. Saravara tilted her head slightly, intrigued. "Explain." He tapped a point on the projection, a contested region where House Saravara's influence had begun to wane. "They think we'll prepare for war like they do, by amassing fleets, reinforcing our borders, waiting for the first attack. Instead, we go where they least expect. We secure our allies before they can be turned against us." Velis nodded, understanding dawning in her expression. Political warfare before military. Exactly. Ethan met Saravara's gaze. "We prove that our marriage isn't just a symbol, it's a shift in power. We show them that standing with us is not just the right choice, but the only choice." Saravara considered this for a long moment, then finally, she nodded. "Then we begin immediately." It was decided. The following days were spent in constant motion, meetings with key houses, transmissions sent to distant allies, strategic visits to territories that teetered on the edge of loyalty. Ethan traveled alongside Saravara and her sisters, witnessing firsthand the delicate dance of Zalvoran politics. Strength was respected, but it was cunning that decided rulers. Every conversation was a battle, every pledge a fragile promise that could be broken the moment it ceased to be convenient. Yet slowly momentum shifted. Some houses hesitated to oppose them outright. Others, seeing the tide turning, pledged their support. The opposition, once united in quiet defiance, began to fracture. But Ethan knew victory wouldn't come so easily. It was on the third night of negotiations that the next attempt on his life came. He had retired to his chambers, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. Sleep had just begun to take him when he felt it, a shift in the air, the faintest sound of displaced movement. Instinct took over. He rolled from the bed a fraction of a second before the dagger struck, embedding itself in the pillow where his throat had been. He hit the ground hard, reaching for the weapon at his side, but the assassin was fast. A shadowed figure lunged, a second blade flashing in the dim light. Ethan barely managed to twist away, the edge slicing across his forearm instead of his heart. Pain flared, but he didn't stop moving. The room was too confined, too easy for the assassin to control. He needed space. With a sharp feint, he drove forward, forcing his attacker back just enough to dive for the door. It burst open before he reached it. Saravara was the first through, her eyes burning with fury. She moved like a predator, faster than Ethan had ever seen, her blade flashing in a clean, merciless arc. The assassin barely had time to react before the strike found its mark, cutting deep into their shoulder. They staggered, but before they could recover, Vexari was on them, her own blade finishing what Saravara had begun. The assassin collapsed, their breath gurgling. Blood pooled beneath them. Silence fell. Ethan exhaled heavily, pressing a hand against his bleeding arm. That was close. Saravara turned to him, her expression fierce. Too close. Vexari nudged the assassin's body with her boot. This was no common mercenary. This was a professional. Oravana entered last, surveying the scene with narrowed eyes. Which means our enemies are getting desperate. Ethan wiped the blood from his arm, his jaw tightening. Good. Saravara arched a brow. You find this outcome good? He met her gaze, unwavering. It means we're winning. A slow smile touched her lips, not of amusement, but of understanding. Outside, the city slept, unaware of how close their future had come to the edge of a blade. But within these walls, the war had already begun. And Ethan knew one thing for certain. He would not fall so easily. The flames of war were no longer whispers in the dark. They were embers catching wind, ready to consume everything. Ethan stood in the war chamber, watching as the final pieces fell into place. The Zalvoran noble houses had drawn their lines. Those who stood against House Saravara had begun gathering their forces, rallying under the banner of old traditions, claiming that their empire must remain pure, untainted by human influence. Those who swore allegiance to Saravara and her sisters had fortified their holdings, their fleets prepared to defend what they now saw as an undeniable future. It would not be long before the first true battle erupted. Saravara studied the hollow map with a calculating gaze, her fingers tapping idly against the surface. Their fleet is massing in the Orva sector, she murmured. A show of strength. They think we will hesitate. Vexari scoffed. Then they've forgotten who we are. Oravana remained silent, though her sharp eyes betrayed her thoughts. She was already planning, already 10 steps ahead. Ethan exhaled, crossing his arms. They don't think we'll hesitate. They're trying to draw us out. Savara leaned against the wall, idly spinning a dagger between her fingers. So what do? Walk into their trap. Saravara's golden eyes flicked toward Ethan.
No.
We set our own. Velis, quiet until now, stepped forward. You have something in mind? It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded. They expect us to meet them head-on. Instead, we hit them where they're weakest before they're ready. He pointed at a sector just beyond Orva's. Their supply routes. Their logistics. If we take those, they can gather all the ships they want, it won't matter. They'll crumble before they ever reach the battlefield. Saravara's lips curled in approval. Deprive them of the means to fight, and they lose the war before it even begins. Vexari cracked her knuckles. Finally, something to do. Oravana's voice remained measured. It won't be easy. They will anticipate resistance. Ethan smirked. Then we'll make sure we're more than resistance. The decision was made. Within hours, preparations were underway. Ethan stood on the bridge of the Stormwraith, the sleek warship now under his command. It had once belonged to Saravara's personal fleet, but she had given it to him without hesitation.
A symbol, she had said.
To our enemies and to our allies. He had no intention of letting it go to waste. As the ship moved into position alongside the others in the fleet, a voice crackled over the comms. Targets confirmed. Enemy's supply fleet is en route. Estimated time to interception: 15 minutes. Saravara's voice followed. We strike swiftly. We leave nothing behind. Ethan tightened his grip on the console, feeling the familiar rush of battle settle into his bones. He had fought in countless skirmishes before, led men into hopeless situations, and pulled them out alive. This was different. This wasn't just a mission. It was the beginning of something far greater. The countdown reached 0. The enemy fleet emerged from hyperspace. Ethan gave the order. Engage. The void erupted into chaos. Plasma cannons fired, streaks of blue and red tearing through the darkness. Zalvoran warships moved with deadly precision, slicing through enemy lines with ruthless efficiency. The Storm Wraith weaved through the battle, its weapons carving a path through the supply vessels. Explosions bloomed in the distance, one after another, the enemy's reinforcements crumbling before they could even react. Ethan moved through the command deck like a storm, issuing orders, adjusting tactics, ensuring that every strike was calculated, every maneuver precise. Saravara's fleet didn't fight like conquerors. They fought like predators, relentless and unyielding. One by one, the enemy ships fell. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. Silence hung over the battlefield, broken only by the occasional burst of static from the comms. The enemy fleet had been shattered. The supply lines were gone. And House Saravara had just delivered a message that no one would ignore. Ethan exhaled, watching the debris drift through the void. Saravara's voice came through the channel, steady and certain. It has begun. He nodded, feeling the weight of what they had just done. This was no longer about proving their union's strength. It was about shaping the future of an empire. And they would not fail.